Hi, Jeanne, it's Joan. How are you, dear? Thanks for joining us. I think you're on mute.
Okay.
There
My
you are.
pleasure. Well, I'm looking forward
You
to
can be
talking with you.
off of mute. So let me give you a little, everyone, a little intro about Jeanne. She has 42 years of service at the University of Denver, director of the Beck Archives and director of Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society. She was recently inducted into the Colorado Authors Hall of Fame, joining horror icon Stephen King and late musician John Denver. She's here to enlighten us on her wonderful book, The First Ladies of the Republic. So, to begin with, um, do you think that each of those wonderful first ladies would describe the role of first lady differently if you had a chance to talk with them?
I always hesitate to kind of try to see what was exactly in their minds at the time. We know that Martha Washington really approached the job very reluctantly. She wrote one of her nieces that she felt like she was a state prisoner. But I think most people in what we now call the White House might feel the same. I ran across a entry from Truman where he referred to the White House as the Great White Prison. So, you're obviously living in a goldfish bowl. I think Martha Washington was exceptionally sociable, but she liked being at home in her own milieu. I think that Abigail professed to be reluctant about it, but I think she was such a partner with her husband, John, that she would have been bereft if they had been physically separated. They had been separated more than enough. I think at one point she wrote in their 14 years at that point of marriage, they were separated for more than half of that. So she was certainly a support. And I think we'll talk about this probably a little later. I think she was a true partner intellectually, politically, emotionally, all those things. I think Dolley Madison probably reveled in her role. I think I read somewhere that she was born sociable and she loved people, really knew how to adapt herself to whatever the personality or the background of the person she was with. Sometimes she was criticized for that when she had one of her early squeezes, as it was called, one of her early parties. In the White House, someone she had been friendly with wrote and said, they allowed all the riffraff in, people coming in with boots and somebody who was quite elitist and felt that she had really maybe demeaned the role of president and first lady on a certain level. But that was one of her talents, I think, really being able to adapt. So how did they feel? I'm sure all of them again felt they were creating a role from scratch. There was a lot of dissension. I think we have this rosy view sometimes of the past when we think politics are so rancorous today. It was true really from the beginning. So except for that honeymoon period, I would say for Washington, after that, there was a lot of dissension.
Do you think that their regional backgrounds helped to shape their roles as First Lady? And fact or fiction, did the term First Lady start with Dolly or did it come after?
Right. Okay. So did their regional backgrounds. I think for Martha, yes. I mean, I think she was raised almost to be a manager of a plantation, even though her parents were more modest than what she eventually ended up with. And to manage not only manage a plantation, but to be like a social mistress as well, and to really and Dolly came from a little more modest background. Remember Martha Washington, after her first husband passed away, she was probably the richest widow in Virginia. So she had didn't have to struggle financially, had a lot of help with enslaved people on her plantations. And she was a very hard worker herself, but it wasn't done on her own. Dolly came from a much more modest background, and I don't know that we'll go into that here, but she had so many challenges in terms of her first marriage, her husband and her baby and her in-laws died during the yellow fever epidemic. So she was rather bereft. And, I think it was on one level a love match, her marriage with Madison, but I think it was also security for her. And then Abigail is a very different sort. She is the child of a clergyman and a daughter and a granddaughter of people who were politically central in Massachusetts and in their area. She was very erudite, homeschooled, we'd call it today, because her parents didn't necessarily believe any higher education for girls, and she was sickly as a child, so they were very protective. But she was also raised to manage a household, and she was very adept at that. And I should also say, I think where women may have been more idealized in the South, even though there was definitely a hierarchical setup of family in New England, women were considered very important. And I think she was a true partner, so she did whatever it took wherever she needed to go. I'm going to have to interrupt for domesticity for 1 second. I'm going to burn my supper if I don't turn off the ovens. I'll
Uh-oh.
be right back. Okay.
Oh boy.
That seems appropriate.
Wow, it sure
Right?
does. Well, while she's gone, let me give you this wonderful quote that I found.
I'm back, but that's
Well,
okay.
I was just one
That's
of
wonderful.
one of the wonderful quotes that I found. Um, These three spirited first ladies, who in their time could not even vote or hold office, exercised intelligence and initiative to transcend boundaries between the public and the private arena. At the time when women's lives were circumscribed by laws and customs, how do you think that the first ladies understood and used their unofficial power as they held as the wife of the president?
So, a couple of things. First of all, you're talking about three really unusual, unique women, and
Sure.
they all had a number of strengths. So, none of the three would have even imagined stepping out of the bounds of what they considered the proper role for a woman. But I think they pushed those boundaries wherever they saw some holes or some avenues to go forward. And at least two of them, Martha and Abigail, Dolly was too young, but I think the American Revolution changed roles for women, at least temporarily, in many ways. They often had to step into quasi-male roles. So you have what we call Abigail becoming what we would say a deputy husband. I mean, she took care of all the duties at home while John was in Congress and then later abroad. So she pushed those. She wrote at one point that if women, could have voted, she would have been thrilled about that. But she certainly stayed within her domestic role. Martha, I think, also pushed where she could, and they all recognized that social interactions were an avenue for political influence and success. So they were all involved, I would say, in promoting their husbands. And I think it's more useful to look at the three marriages not so much as a male binary divide, but as a partnership, a family partnership. And they saw themselves as advancing their families. And so, whatever it took, they certainly, pursued that route. So, even though Martha, as I said, was not happy to be moving to, what was then the first capital, New York, then Philadelphia. She felt it was her duty to step into the role and to do the best to support and promote her husband. So I think all three of them. Dolly may have been the most in terms of social. Um, Abigail was probably the most politically astute of the three.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe the causes that each was very concerned with and what they championed and how strongly they felt about the causes that were important to them?
So all of them were involved in different charities, I would say. But Martha, it's interesting. I would say the most overt political gesture she made was very vocal support for officers and soldiers after the war, and trying to lobby to get Congress to pay them and to reward them in some way. So that was probably her most overt, although during the American Revolution, women supported the revolution in a variety of ways. One of them was actually fundraising. And Martha contributed, again, remember, she was a wealthy widow. She contributed a significant amount toward clothing for the soldiers, and she helped encourage other women to do so. I think the one who was actually mostly in charge of it was Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Sally, in Philadelphia. But Martha was, because of her position and her prestige, was considered kind of the unofficial chair, I would say. So certainly the cause of the troops was something that she paid a lot of attention to in small charities.
I thought that was pretty interesting because that's one wonderful fact that I had never known about Martha Washington. She really didn't come into the limelight much in readings. It was always about George. So I thought that was really interesting that we learned a really wonderful fact about her with her cause with the veterans.
Yeah, and I don't want to jump from one area to another, but I think there's been a stereotype of Martha as like the little woman standing behind George and, helping him, I don't know, serving him food, helping him get tending to him if he was sick. But she was a very bright woman and she read voraciously. She read nothing like Abigail Adams, but she read the newspapers, she read novels, some history, and really followed the progress of the troops. And it's said that Washington discussed some of his plans, and you have to credit her for physically accompanying Washington during the war to almost every war camp. She probably had superior quarters at times, and she may have actually even stayed, on the periphery at a farmhouse or someone's home. But she gave up that very comfortable lifestyle at home to be at his side. So I think that that is interesting, and I think again, she had the help of her brother when she was widowed financially, but she was pretty astute and was able to, keep hold of her funds very well.
That's great. Do you think the three ladies uh, did you think that they learned from each other, and do you think that amongst the three of them, did they have any kind of a friendship bond?
Yes, well, I would say certainly Abigail revered Mrs. Washington. They did have a pretty close friendship. Abigail admired Martha greatly, and when John was elected, she even sent a letter to Martha and asked her for advice on how she, thought it would be best to carry out her role. But she always, if you read part of the books with letters that Abigail sent to her sisters, and Abigail and John's correspondence, and I would say Abigail in particular, are it's just marvelous reading the letters. They were such wonderful writers, and they probably knew, they wanted their letters preserved for posterity. But the letters exchanged between Abigail and her sisters are a great insight. And she talked about how much she admired Martha, that Martha was very simple but elegant, and everything was done in the best of taste. So she did try to mimic in many ways how Martha conducted her salons. I would say Abigail, once she got to be running her own salons, she was a little more politically involved in discussions, etc. But she looked to her for that right balance, what they were all searching for, and maybe Dolley maybe went a little too much the other way, but they were trying to differentiate the American court, the Republican court, from European courts, and somehow strike the right balance with gravitas, but not excess. And so they were very careful about not going over the top. Now, Dolley did, I would say, had an Americanized version of European courts. And so she was, I would say, somewhat more extravagant, but she did still put her own stamp on it. And kind of, she'd be, I don't know that she served apple pie, but I'm saying she tried to make the menu more American, so to speak. But she did admire some of the styles. But Martha wasn't on a throne, but she was on a chair on a raised platform during these, salons. So they kind of tried to walk that fine line.
So can you talk a little bit more about the difference between the Republican court and what was called the royal court, and you touched a little bit about it, but who followed it more, which side the three followed more than the other?
Yeah, well, as I said, the first two certainly did, and Dolly perhaps not as much. I think we get an even better insight when we start to read um, uh, Abigail's letters from Europe after she actually visits the European courts, not just what she reads or hearsay. So again, hugely marvelous letters. When she first visits the King and Queen of England, and she tells her sister how they have audiences, I guess you would say, and everybody lines, hundreds of people line up on the periphery of the main room they're in, and then the King and Queen go to each person and they make the same, how are you? Same social niceties over and over again. And they're left standing for hours. And she talks about how that contrasts with the more simple, what she considers superior American lifestyle. And she said she criticizes the king and queen. Not only is the talk inane, but she doesn't think they're very good looking, and that their dress is not that impressive. And she always goes back and compares them to the wonderful, beautiful girls in New England and how they dress and how they behave. So again, it's certainly not the extravagance. And when John Adams is in Europe even before Abigail joins him, and he's there for a number of years. He's at the court of Versailles many times, and he actually pays to be seated where he can watch the king and queen at dinner. And people pay for that, and the opulence. And even though, he says you can go through the palace and you'll see the cracks and you'll see there's a veneer of this grandeur and money, but you can see that the underneath things are financially already stressed. So they're consciously trying not to copy that pattern. And again, everything should be in the best of taste. They shouldn't scrimp on that, but not to that waste and that extravagance.
Do you think their fashion statements sort of went either towards the federal court or towards the royal court with how the first ladies dressed? You think that was an impact on their philosophy or what their
Well,
role
yes,
was?
I mean, Martha consciously, I mean, when she went to George's inauguration, she consciously wore a dress that was made in America without importing any fancy British or French fabrics, and that was a statement.
Um, Dolly, do you think that when she was working with Jefferson as sort of his quasi first lady, did she change her role when she actually became that first lady?
I think maybe more of, but similar. But Jefferson professed simplicity. He often came to the table with his slippers on. He was trying to kind of convey that kind of homespun image, although, when he went to Europe, he came back with um, crates and crates of beautiful art and something like 600 bottles of wine. So it was kind of conflicted, I would say, about elegance. But Dolly, I think just more so. Obviously, she wanted to please Jefferson. She wanted to further her husband's career. But once she was in charge, she certainly, um, I think, again, separating from the royal courts, but her clothing was often quite extravagant.
Hmm. Uh, do you think that they use their levees, their parlors, their social interactions? Did you think that helped their husbands in their political adventures?
Definitely, definitely. You remember, there's no social media, there's no television. Uh,
Right.
there are newspapers, but they're not the same way we have today. So it was local. And yes, this was an opportunity to kind of convince and try out new ideas. Whether they have a cough, now I have one.
Uh-oh. Talking about Abigail, do you think, in your research, I mean, she's a very interesting person and very politically minded. Do you think she was involved too much? And do you feel that her strong views on that Alien and Sedition Act really led to John's demise in his second term?
Yes and no.
Okay.
She was very involved. She was a sounding board. She was so politically savvy and intelligent, and admired by so many of the leaders until Jefferson defeated Adams. Thomas Jefferson and Abigail Adams were fast friends, and he admired her. He called her like a superb economist. She ran the household, and he admired that. I think her downfall really, I wouldn't say downfall. Her weakness was she was blindingly loyal to her husband. So that could be good, and that could be bad. And in terms of the Alien Sedition Act, she was very thin-skinned about any criticism of her husband, and that was why she pushed that. And yes, I do think it unfortunately contributed to his defeat.
Sure. So, as you were writing this book in your research, were there any surprises or anything that you left out of your writing, or anything about the three first ladies that you really were surprised about when you were writing about them?
Well, I don't know that this was a surprise, but as I said, I found Martha Washington to be much stronger personality than we've been led to believe. I think she was a very capable manager, and I think I think she actually boosted Washington's popularity with his troops as well. Because she was in all the camps, she was kind of a quasi mother figure, I think, to a lot of the soldiers. And so I think that was helpful for her. I think I don't know that I was surprised, but I just saw this more and more that, they're living in an era where marriages, if not arranged, they're more political in outlook. Matches are made often for financial purposes, for political purposes. I think I saw over and over again with John and Abigail. I think you really have soulmates there. Um, and that doesn't mean they didn't sometimes disagree, etc. But they really connected on so many different levels. Dolly, yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, Dolley Madison, I think, was extremely fond of um, James Madison, and I think she was also extremely loyal. I mean, she took honestly such good care of him. He was sickly, a lot of things went wrong, and she was a very positive person. And she did use politics. I mean, her a number of her family members were in politics, and I should say all three of the ladies really worked on kind of promoting a family dynasty. Martha and George Washington didn't have any biological children together, but some of her relatives and some of his relatives, they worked to help get them into politics. Abigail and John probably groomed John Quincy for his role from childhood. And Dolly also promoted a number of her relatives. It was sad, as I said, she lost a baby. She and Madison never had any biological children, and her son from her first marriage was kind of a classical ne'er-do-well. They were always bailing him out of one problem after another. So she could have become, I think, a very bitter person, but everyone says that she was unfailingly cheerful and supportive.
Uh, so I've thrown out a lot of questions, but maybe the one thing I'd like to ask is of the three of Martha and Abigail and Dolly, is there anything that else that you would like to tell us about them that maybe I didn't bring up in questions?
No, I have to say that my favorite is Abigail Adams by a mile. So I would encourage people to read as many, and there are a lot of anthologies that you don't have to read all her letters, but to read her letters to see what life was like during the war, what sacrifices people made, and a wonderful travel log. Her stay in Europe is really marvelous. It exposes all her intelligence, all her love of culture, etc. And it also shows how she was narrow-minded in some ways too. And she was, but again, once she was loyal to something, I mean, she constantly compared America, which she found far superior in almost every way to Europe, and sent all those letters to her sisters explaining that. The only thing that she felt was somewhat superior in Europe was um, the education that some women received. And while she was there, for example, she went to a series of scientific lectures. And she wrote and she told, I think it was a niece, that it was, really like going, into a different world. She was just enamored of those opportunities and she took them wherever she could. But when you read, you'll see how well read she is. They're constantly quoting works of history, political science, religion, science, everything. So I would say explore Abigail more, and you might want to take a look at sometime at my book on A View from Abroad, which is the story of Jeanne and Abigail Adams in Europe, which was just a marvelous time.
And I will love always the quote, remember the ladies.
Right. Although let me just say that that's been misused a little bit. She certainly did, but it was not a broad plea for women's rights. I really don't believe that Abigail was a proto-feminist, but I think she was ahead of her time in many ways in terms of support for education for women. But she was, and that remember the lady, she was really talking about specifically about coverture, the laws that literally means covered by their husbands, that a married woman didn't have a separate economic role in the world or, political role. And so she was kind of railing against those limitations and abusive husbands, and etc.
Hmm.
But But just maybe to close, another thing that I always admired was that Abigail, in her day, making a will was not a legal document. She wasn't allowed to do that, but she made a will, and she left a lot of her possessions to women in her family, including some investments she had made. And I think even more impressive is that John honored that will. The
Ah,
Hmm.
didn't
Hmm.
have to, and he did carry it out. So that's all I have to say.
um, before I turn it back over to Sarah, I know the group will have some questions for you. What is your new project? Are you working on another book?
I'm not working on a book. I'm doing articles. I just worked, I had an article published on Abigail Adams in the Wall Street Journal. I think it was in September. They have a section called Wall Street Journal Reports, and this year they're doing a four-part series to celebrate America's 250th. And so they came to me and asked if I would write a little article for them on Abigail as an entrepreneur.
Oh,
So I
nice.
did that. You can go online and find it. And I just finished up another article they asked me to do for the last of the four on American founders as medical innovators. So
Wow.
talking about their role in conquering smallpox. So, and oh, and then I have an article too coming out. I just forgot all about it. In I think it'll be the end of January from Trend and Tradition. It's the magazine of Colonial Williamsburg, and it's about American women's role in the American Revolution.
Oh, wow.
You
Well,
could
I
find
thank you
those
so much
online.
for your wonderful discussion with me, but I'm going to turn it back over now to Sarah and the group because I know the group will have some wonderful questions for you. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your great questions, and sorry I started coughing in the middle. So hopefully we'll
That's okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful. We're very appreciative. Um, I'd also just like to point out if anyone was not a part of our uh, original voting process for this year's book club, another one that was on the table, which I can also recommend in addition to all of Jeannie's research, is My Dearest Friend. This is the one that's on my um, shelf, which really dives deep into John and Abigail's letters and is really fascinating on Abigail's inner voice. So I'd like to turn this over to the group. I know we have some folks who haven't been with us for a while this evening. If there are any discussion points that you are interested in bringing up to the group at large, or if you have any other questions about the book or about these wonderful women for Jeannie, we would love to hear them. Just keep in mind that if your camera is not on, I will not be able to see if you're waving. So you'll have to ping me in another way.
Uh,
Craig, did you have something?
Well, I am curious as to, thank you for your excellent observations and insights. I am curious as to whether you've gotten a chance to compare notes with the author of another one of our books. Was it this year, I think? Dinner with the Presidents, Alex Prudhomme, if I have that anywhere near correct. But it's a fascinating book. I'd be surprised if you haven't read it. I was wondering whether you had a chance to have any interaction with him.
No, I haven't had any interaction, but it is very interesting.
Oh, I hope you do get the chance. I'm sure you hope you get the chance
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. It's not, I'm retired now for 2 years, so I've been taking art lessons, going out in different directions. So I try to keep a hand in it, but I'm trying to enjoy retirement.
Very good. Very good. Well, of course, it's some of the same themes, of course, come up, and the intersection of domesticity and
Mhm.
political life, etc., are fascinating. And I think you really deepened. That book is a little more superficial for obvious reasons, and I really enjoyed deepening the knowledge, especially of these important ladies, the
Thank
way
you.
that you laid it out. Yeah.
Go ahead, Carol.
Sarah,
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
sorry.
So which one do you want?
Sure, let's go Carol, then Vicky. And I just also like to point out if anyone is not comfortable being on camera, you can also type in the chat if you prefer me to read a question or comment.
So I just wanted to go back for a small minute for to remember the ladies quote. I think it was Gordon S. Wood in the book that we read, Friends Divided. His discussion of that was it was kind of a teasing way that they had sort of this teasing banter back and forth, and that his interpretation was that, yeah, according to how I remember reading the book, that it was, yeah, it's almost said in jest. What do you think about that?
I don't think she said it in jest. I think he tried to laugh it off because it was a threat. He wrote somewhere, I think to his son, he was worried if women would have certain rights, it would go down a slippery slope and they'd get to vote and everything else. And he was right. It happened
Uh,
positively. Um, I don't think I mean it's my personal opinion. I don't think she meant it in jest. I think she had, spent a lot of very hard years at home, managing so many and with so many challenges. But I think he kind of just, sort of laughed it off and made it sound as if it was, just a joke. I don't think she meant it as a joke. But again, I think it was very specific. I don't think she was asking in that for the right to vote or anything that broad. I think it was very specific.
It struck me in the Ken Burns documentary that a couple of people were pointing out that none of these guys really expected democracy as we know it today. That's not what they had planned when they were thinking about this. And I think that kind of comes through in that discussion back and forth.
And I think we also have to remember I try to when I was teaching students all the time, we have to try to not impose our current ideas and on prior generations. They're all human. I don't think we have a number of slave owners. But they did some good things. So you're going to have to figure out how to balance those things and not throw out the baby with the bathwater and, on some level. So I think here too, I think Adams was very progressive about women for his time. He respected his wife greatly until he had a falling out with Mercy Warren, another of the female intellectuals at the time. He was a great supporter of Mercy Warren. And, I think, again, for his time, he was progressive. I think he was much more progressive than Jefferson in terms of women.
yeah.
Great. Sorry for prolonging that. Vicky, go ahead.
Oh, no, first of all, Jeanne, thank you very much. I I was looking, I was very interested in your bibliography. I've um had part of my career as a university professor, so I get interested in sourcing and so I was very interested in why you chose these three women and decided to dig into this and what was your motivation for writing the book to begin with?
So I see the three books that I wrote on America's founders as a trilogy in a way.
Okay.
So my first book in this trilogy was Revolutionary Medicine, the Founding Fathers and Mothers in Sickness and in Health. And while I was doing that, I became especially interested in the women at that time. And then after I did First Ladies, of the women, as I told you, hands down, Abigail is my favorite. And so I wanted to do something with Abigail and John, but I wanted it to be, I mean, there've been so many biographies and so many dual biographies of the two of them. I wanted to just do a slice that really kind of reflected how they felt about being Americans and what differentiated Americans from Europeans. So the third book was, I consider it the Abigail book, but it's about just a slice in time. They're just their years in Europe. So that's how I got into it. When I was really focused on medicine in the first book, but the more and more I got into their letters, and if you were a university professor too, you know, we are so fortunate now that we have online access to so many things.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was able to go through something called Founders Online, which you can, it's a United States government website. You can type in the person, you can type in the years, you can go on to the Massachusetts, you know, the John and Abigail Adams letters here and their families. There's at the University of Virginia, there's a project where you get the Dolley Madison's work. So just kind of one thing led to the other. And um, I started a love affair with primary sources when I was a freshman in college. And so I just love the research part, and I love going through all these things and gathering that. So that was kind of my motivation.
Well, I will make one comment. Having uh, grown up in southern Missouri with a southern mother and a German father, and spent time in California and in the Northwest and in New England, I do see a difference in your book. What they're, you know, they kind of come to the First Lady position with, you know, we've got New England, we've got Virginia, and then the very difference with Dolley Madison's not being, you know, part of the landed gentry of, you know, of the revolutionary gang. You know, she grew up in a very different environment. So it was interesting to me to see how those three different, you know, they really did reflect their heritage.
Yeah, I think very much so. And as I said, Martha was trained to be a hostess, so you know that came easier to her. Abigail was trained to be a manager. There's no question, and she has a very New England sensibility, you know, unquestionably. And Dolly, you know, she spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, so she's somewhere in between, you know, she's
Yeah.
somewhere in between. And a family where the father struggled to make a living, right? So she was, and then she married up. You know, her husband was a successful lawyer, and tragically, that's what first got me interested in the medical part, but that she could go on, you know, like that
Yeah.
and rebuild her life.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we had, oh, go ahead, Marcia. Oop, you are still muted. I'm going to click a little button here.
Sorry.
There you
I just wanted to point out that Michelle had something in the chat and then me after her, if you'd like.
go. Okay, I will take a look here. Alrighty. So thanks for joining us, Michelle. She says that she's wondering what Jefferson's impression was of Dolley Madison. And could you say that Dolley outsmarted him by finding a way as a woman and a Republican to connect with the political elite of both parties, men and women, at her salons? She found a way to be politically informed in a way that he was trying to minimize.
Repeat that again, please.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
Sure, Michelle, did you want to clarify?
Just
I was struck
like,
by,
yeah.
yeah, I was struck by how Dolly I think where Thomas Jefferson was trying to minimize these type of gatherings. He didn't want anything contentious, and he was trying to control it. And he had this view of where women, their place was, even though he admired people like Abigail Adams and Martha Washington and such. And I'm sure everyone was aware of that, but I think Dolley still found a way to do what she felt she needed to do, so she wasn't deterred. And I thought I was kind of impressed with that. So I just wondered if you could speak a little to that.
Okay. Yes. Well, I'm sure you saw that quote, and it's always fascinated me when Madison defeated his contender, where he said, I could have prevailed over Madison, but not Mr. and Mrs. Madison. I'm not quoting exactly. So yes, I think, don't you know a lot of people like that who
Huh,
who
I found that
right, who quietly
maybe.
in the background get to do exactly what they want, but outwardly,
yeah.
I think Jefferson, yes, I think Jefferson hated contention for, in many areas. And, if you read Revolutionary Medicine, he suffered from migraine headaches and stomach issues a lot. And I think it was always when there was some contention, going on that came up. But I think she was smart enough and naturally sociable that she could really work both sides of the aisle. And I think that may have come from the fact that, she starts out again in a very modest background and marries this attorney who's a step up socially for her, and then Madison, who's part of the landed gentry. And so she's really scaled all those, kind of a wide range of experience, and it gives her tools, I think, to really interact with anyone.
It was kind of impressive to me. I wonder if Abigail Adams was in that position, if she would fire back at Jefferson in some way, react. Like, so Dolley Madison didn't seem to react. She said, you know what, I'm going to do what I want. I don't, she found a way. Yeah.
Well, as I told you, Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson just were great fans of one another in the beginning, and especially in Europe. They bought clothing and china and things for each other, one in Paris and they just, it was wonderful again until they had a falling out. But Abigail never, very strong personality, and that, I think that was a weakness of hers. So loyal to her husband, that she could never forgive Jefferson, whereas Jefferson and Adams reconciled, in their later years, and had a marvelously delightful correspondence. So yes, I think Abigail was probably, I guess we'd call it, more rigid. I don't think she was unusually rigid, but more so than and I think someone once said that Dolley Madison had kind of a chameleon-like personality, so
Hmm.
she could adapt herself to whatever was going on. And so she got along fine with Jefferson. She probably, kind of played the role of hostess, submissive, loving wife, and he was fine with that. Madison was his protege. So they were fine. And Adams, in one of his letters, actually remarks that he was at dinner with Dolley Madison when he was in Philadelphia, long before he was president, long before Dolley became the first lady, and he admired her and thought she was a wonderful hostess. So again, people from all different personalities, all different backgrounds. She seemed to be able to manage them all.
Yeah, I loved your book, by the way. Thank you for writing it.
Hmm.
That was really good. Yeah.
Okay. I being a girl from Quincy, Massachusetts, I agree with the notion that Abigail is, of course, superior to any of the others. But I'm always been particularly interested in how equally matched she seemed to be to John in her intellect. Um, and I'll just put a little aside here that although with Dolley Madison, you know, I admire anyone who can pull off wearing a turban, but Abigail, for her intellect and her ability to express herself in her letters, really sort of stands out. I found myself musing a little bit today about the more recent first ladies and those who were of, in my estimation, of equal intellect for the presidents that they were with. And I say, in my estimation, Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama, both very of equal education and intellect to their husbands. But I wonder if you had thought at all about this sort of going forward, the people that have, the first ladies that have come since, and what changes they made and what impacts they made at all.
Well, I again will agree. Abigail Adams is probably my number one favorite. I would put Eleanor Roosevelt up there as well. Um, I don't remember one of the op-eds that I wrote. I can't remember if it was one in the Washington Post or the one for the Wall Street Journal, where I said I think if Abigail lived in our day and age, she would have been president. And there's a quote that I use, I think, in the last article, two things, that some very erudite men in Boston claimed when John Adams was president that if he died in office, there was no other person except Abigail that they would want to fill his shoes. So, and when I at the end of the article on Abigail Adams as an entrepreneur, I did speculate, and I said, in our day and age, maybe she would have been head of the Fed. I don't, I think she could have done all those things. So I think I admire her scholarship and her intelligence. That's probably the most outstanding. And yes, I think she was John's equal, and I think he realized that. I think he took her comments very seriously. And again, that Alien Sedition Act, I believe, was a mistake, but I think it was her overzealousness to protect his reputation. She was really upset with newspaper editors who had criticized him, and that was her, one section of it was her way of getting back at that.
Thank you.
Which shows you that even very intelligent people can make tactical mistakes and let their emotions rule.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of interested in the generational aspect of this as we've been talking, especially about the preconceived notions that we have about some of these people. And I wonder how each of us or any of us learned about people like Martha Washington when we were in school, or if at all. Because while I don't necessarily remember learning very much, I did grow up in a very specific generation, and I'm going to move my computer to show you which generation that is. And I had a lot of books growing up that were very specifically women's history for children and talking about Martha Washington marching off to war, with her husband and really pulling her weight. So I wonder if anyone else was, surprised by some of the revelations in this book, or if they were, if they already knew very much about these women beforehand.
No.
Well, I learned a lot about Martha Washington. I didn't know anything about the first ladies or women. Put myself in the 60 age group. No, I didn't know anything. And still today, when you read some historical, nonfiction books, you don't really, there's a little line here, tag here about Martha Washington or someone else. So I really appreciated the additional information. It was funny because a couple of years ago, I went to Mount Vernon to visit with my daughter, and there was a reenactor dressed up as Martha Washington, and no one noticed her. And we followed her, and she went into this room to sit there and talk to people who came by. So we had a like one-on-one, audience with her. It was just us, and I'm thinking, what do I ask her? What do I talk?
Wow.
And I didn't realize how involved she was, being with Washington all the time, especially during the winters, as he set up planning for battle and so on, and how she supported the army. It didn't really come up in some of the books I read, so I really appreciated that additional information, and the fact that she donated her own money and her business sense to continue on her as a widow, her husband Custis estate as she did, just showed how intelligent she was and how she figured things out and how resilient she was. And I appreciated reading that.
And you're saying that one thing again strikes me over and over again, how resilient they were. Can you
Yeah.
imagine? Martha lost all her four children. Abigail and Jeanne Addams were predeceased. They had six children by four of them. And Dolley Madison, only that one child who was a heartache to them. He was in jail, so many things going on. And yet they had the fortitude to move on and keep going. I mean, it's amazing to me.
I want to
Mention all their illnesses.
I want to share a photo I took. I don't know if this is on the screen now and how well you can see it, but it's a photo I took from the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, which was my first exposure to the idea that, Martha Washington traveled hundreds of miles, was a sustaining force at Valley Forge and all that. I took the photo mainly for the exquisite pleasure of sending it to my wife, Martha, and exposing her to the exploits of great Marthas in history.
Right.
Great. Go ahead, Mary. Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
First, I want to thank the author. Thank you, Jeanne Abrams. And this book humanized Martha Washington. I always thought of her just as the character in that companion, was it a Gilbert Stuart piece, looking rather staid and stuffy, and this is the way it is. And I realized she had a real personality. And that was my first experience with Martha's personality. So thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. There are many, many biographies of all three of them, so you can, if you want to dig in deeper. And I had a specific, slant to what I was trying to do for each of them, but there are many, many books you can pursue.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're just a little past 8 o'clock. So we should probably begin talking about our next meeting. But before I begin to wrap things up, does anyone have any last minute comments?
Yes, I hope your dinner isn't too cold and that it didn't burn.
Right, my husband's at a class, and we will eat afterwards. We'll be fine.
Okay.
I'm 2 hours earlier, so it's only 6 o'clock here.
Very reassuring. Good.
I'm glad everything's working out. And thank you so much for joining us this evening, Jeanne. It means a lot to us.
It was a pleasure, and it was nice to have such a interactive and intelligent audience. So thank you.